More and more these days, it seems like politics might as well be a dirty word. Few sane folks seem excited to talk about it. It's like getting the annual inspection for your car. No one is looking forward to it, but we have to make it happen, so let's get it done with. You can find polls left, right, and center, pun intended, that show that as a country we're more divided over politics today than we have been in more than a century. Political differences rip apart relationships, friendships, even families. When we think of our most prominent politicians, often we think about scandal, incompetence, wrongdoing, and any other host of negative ideas. Sometimes it seems like it would just be nice to totally jettison the idea of politics as a whole. But the reality is that simply isn't an option for us as human beings. The Greek philosopher Aristotle insisted that man is a political creature. I think he's actually basically right, though I think that's because he wasn't necessarily talking about democracy or any governmental system in particular. See, the Greek word there that we translate political or politics came from the word for a polis, a city, a group of people living together and cooperating with each other. What Aristotle was getting at, and part of what we're about to see in the Bible this morning, is that we are creatures, we are human beings designed to live in connection with each other, and what Aristotle didn't know, with God. As a poet once put it, no man is an island. None of us are isolated from each other. And so we're launching today into a sermon series that we call Church Politics. But we're going with the definition of politics as getting things done together. When we talk about politics for the remainder of the series, we mean anything where you as a human being have to get things done together. So we'll be talking about how we should go about living with each other in our differences and our similarities, our agreements and our disputes. There will be times where there are direct applications where there are direct applications to national, state, and local government, the things we think of when we think the word politics. And we won't shy away from those. But perhaps even more so, we think and we hope that there will be great applications for the ways that we get things done together as a community, a church, as families and friends and workplaces and schools and whatever other context that God has put you in where you have to get things done together with other people. So as we launch into the series, we're going to start by looking at why we were actually made for politics as human beings, what went wrong and got things twisted off course, and what our hope for politics should look like in the future. And we're going to start where most stories do. We're going to start at the beginning. So we're going to read Genesis chapter 1, verses 26 through 28. This comes towards the end of the creation narrative as God has created everything else, and He is just going to create humanity. Genesis 1, starting at verse 26. Then God said, "Let us make man in our image, after our likeness, and let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the heavens, and over the livestock, and over all the earth, and over every creeping thing that creeps on the earth." So God created man in His own image. In the image of God He created him. Male and female He created them. And God blessed them. And God said to them, "Be fruitful, and multiply, and fill the earth, and subdue it, and have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the heavens, and over every living thing that moves on the earth." Three things that we're going to see here this morning in the creation narrative. One having to do with God, one having to do with us, one having to do with the relationship between the two. So first, about God, we see here in the passage that humans are created for community because God is community. Oddly enough, or maybe appropriately enough, we're actually starting in the same place we did for our sermon series on gender and sexuality last year after Easter. Yes, we apparently are just stepping on every cultural third rail immediately after Easter. That's just how we're doing it as a church right now. But we started the same way back then, looking at who God is and how that relates to us being created in His image, as the passage said. If we believe that, if we believe that we as human beings are created in God's image, then that means that who we are, the core of what makes us human, connects back to who God is in the way that we are image bearers of God. We see God's plurality in that first verse we read this morning, where it said, "Let us make man in our image." We see here in Genesis 1, and as well as later when John 1 recounts creation as well, that God's unity is also seen in plurality. That His three-in-one-ness, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, as we sang about earlier in the service, is critical to what we believe about who He is and who He has made us as human beings. Because we believe in a God who is perfect, eternal community. That the Father, the Son, and the Spirit exist eternally in harmony and, if you take this word for it, diversity. That God is one and God is also three, being different from one another and also the same, unique and also perfectly together. It's a mode of existence that we can't totally wrap our heads around because we aren't God. We use the best words we have for it and do the best we can. But we were also designed as human beings to be a reflection of that reality, a signpost of community, to point each other and all of creation toward God's perfect community. Any instinctual draw that we have toward community as human beings is a draw to be like God, to see His image in each other and in ourselves more fully, to connect to others in harmony amidst differences. And that takes us to what we see about ourselves. We see God, and we also see that we were designed to be connected and united to other human beings. And we can actually take a step further and say we were designed to be connected to other human beings who aren't the same as us, who are different from us. That difference was actually a part of the good creation order. God created us in His image. We're united in that we are all image bearers, but we are not all identical. And we see that right from the start. Male and female, He created them. From the beginning, we are created to be united amidst differences. Uniformity was never a part of God's design. We were designed to point towards God's greatness and glory by how we would be connected to each other, how we would be the same while also being different. The Trinity shows us God in three persons, Father, Son, and Spirit. We, as human beings, were made to be a united community made of unique individuals that would point each other and all of creation toward God in His wholeness. And that's our final point about how we were created. What our politics were supposed to look like. What were we supposed to get done together? We were designed to be united to each other for a purpose. We were given a mission, a mandate to work together, to cultivate God's creation, to explore and discover and create in celebration of our Creator. We were to be united in pointing people to God, in being His reflection, His ambassadors to all of creation. I think a great picture of this that we get later on in the Bible, of this idea that we have a job to do and we have to do it together, is when the church in the New Testament are referred to as saints. It's a term that often gets thrown out to deal with the Christians who are pursuing a mission in a particular community in the New Testament, and it never once gets used in the singular. 60 times in the New Testament, it never once gets used as about one person. It gets used about us as groups, because the job of the church is in a lot of ways an extension of what we were supposed to do as human beings right from the start. We're supposed to reflect God. We're supposed to show Him to our communities, our growing love for Him, our knowledge of Him. We're supposed to point people back to Him. And that was a job that we were given to do at the beginning together, and so we keep trying to do it together. We were created to join together as a team to do the church politics, the getting things done together of reflecting God's image out into the world. But as Christians, most of us probably remember something went wrong. Stuff fell apart. We messed up. Just a couple of chapters after the passage that we read, we see that in our hubris and pride, we said, no, we don't want to be God's image. We want to be God. As my favorite rapper put it, I don't want to be like God, I want to be Him. Choosing pride over humility, we were deceived into seeking God's knowledge and His throne, and so we fell into sin, into selfishness. And as we broke, our politics broke too, the way we got things done together. I think one of the stories that shows up most clearly in comes about 10 chapters after this in Genesis 11, where we see the people of Babel choose to ignore God's command. After the flood, God re-gives that creation mandate. Go and spread out and fill the world. And we see the people of Babel say, no, we don't want to listen to God's command to do that, to spread out across the earth. But they also, as we'll learn here in a sec, begin to ignore His commands about how to treat others, how to do politics together, to get things done together. So let's read Genesis 11. We're going to read verses 1 through 9. Now the whole earth had one language and the same words. And as people migrated from the east, they found a plain in the land of Shinar and settled there. And they said to one another, come, let us make bricks and burn them thoroughly. And they had brick for stone and bitumen for mortar. And then they said, come, let us build ourselves a city and a tower with its top in the heavens, and let us make a name for ourselves, lest we be dispersed over the face of the whole earth. And the Lord came down to see the city and the tower which the children of man had built. And the Lord said, behold, they are one people, and they have all one language. And this is only the beginning of what they will do. And nothing that they propose to do will now be impossible for them. Come, let us go down there and confuse their language so that they may not understand one another's speech. So the Lord dispersed them from there over all the face of all the earth, and they left off building the city. Therefore its name was called Babel, because there the Lord confused the language of all the earth, and from there the Lord dispersed them over the face of all the earth. And we'll pause there. In looking at Genesis 1, we learned a little bit about who God is, who we were designed to be, and how we were supposed to relate to Him. And we're going to hit those same things here in Babel. But first we're going to look at what our relationship with God was meant to be, but now we see how it was broken by the fall. The fall set a pattern for our relationship with God, and it was not a healthy one. We see here the human desire to be God instead of being His reflection, His image, His ambassador, His friend. We see that without active intervention from God, that desire festers and multiplies in the human heart. We see it here in the people of Babel coming together and saying, let's disobey God. Let's refuse to spread out like He told us. Let's make a name for ourselves. Let's define our identity, refusing the adequacy of the name, the purpose that He has given us as a people. Let's choose it for ourselves instead. We see what's happening here, that after the fall, even when we manage to work together as human beings, we tend to pull in the wrong direction. Our unity, whatever there is of it, tends to be unity in folly, in sin, in running as fast as we can the wrong way. That's the most common lesson that tends to get pulled out of the story of Babel. And it's a good one. Our relationship between us and God is broken, and we begin to rebel and push back against Him. But I think there's actually more here as well. That teaches us about our tendency to see each other as either useful or useless. I think there's actually an interesting interpersonal politics lesson here in Babel, where we see that we have, as human beings, because of the fall, become users of other people in one way, shape, or form. I'm going to lean heavily as we talk about this on the work of Hebrew scholar Ari Lamb. Ari is a Hebrew scholar who wrote a fascinating article looking at the Tower of Babel and looking at the places where the words in this story show up elsewhere in the Old Testament to tell us what kind of people are we dealing with here in Babel? What are they doing to each other? What are we seeing? He points out how the word that's translated, let us make bricks. It says, let us make bricks. What other time do you think about people making bricks in the Old Testament? Israelite slaves in Egypt. That's the only other time in the Bible that this phrase gets used. That's it. And wouldn't you know it, it's a group of people being forced to build a building, in Egypt's case pyramids, here the Tower of Babel, for a religious purpose of kind of showing off an alternate religion to the worship of the true God. He points out as well, the first word there, come, let us make bricks. You would think that a single word there wouldn't make that much difference, but that's not the word that gets used for come, do something, anywhere else in the Old Testament except for one other place. Where's that one other place? I'll tell you, because you have no way of knowing it, and I better be the one to tell you. It's in Exodus 1 when the first Pharaoh decides, hey, I've got this group of people, maybe I should make them all my slaves instead of letting them multiply and become too numerous. There's other fascinating stuff here in the story. When God says that Babel was one people, that they were one people, that sounds great, right? That sounds fantastic. You got unity. We're all together. Hurrah. Except that the only other time in the book of Genesis when a group of people is called one people, there's this group over here that goes to this group over here and says, hey, come join with us. We will become one people. Do you know what this group is planning to do to this group a few days later? Murder all of them. Even the oneness, even their oneness is a dirty oneness. It's deceptive, it's tricky, it's stab you in the back oneness. And we get that from the phrase when God says that nothing they propose to do. That word for propose there has the subtext of plotting. This is the proposing or planning that you can only do when your hands are doing this. You can only do it when you're going under your breath, the evil laughter. All of the words in this story about Babel are in some way, shape, or form meant to help us see that when we add it all up, this isn't some benevolent society of wonderful people who just happen to be trying to disobey God's commands to scatter over the face of the earth because they love each other so much and don't want to be parted from each other. No, all these different connections tell us Babel is the first empire. This is a group of powerful people saying, we're going to hold on to control no matter what, held together by the iron fist of slave labor, consolidating wealth and power as much as possible for fear of losing influence. Babel is the prototype for Egypt and Canaan and Babylon and every broken political system that we'll see in the Bible and that we see today that says God is either useful or useless because the goal isn't glorifying Him but getting as much power for us as humanly possible. Their single language even, when we look at the timeline in the Old Testament, isn't necessarily a sign of unity, but of enforced uniformity, forcing everyone to speak the same language so that those in power can better maintain control because no one can say anything they can't understand in secret. The walls of Babel weren't to keep invaders out, they were to keep the slaves in. When we refuse God's leadership, the human leadership that we replace it with will always be broken in one way, shape, or form. But there's one last piece of application if we're pairing Babel with creation, and that's God. What do we see about God here in the passage? And what we find is that He shows the mercy of breaking our brokenness. He gives us the grace of refusing our evil desires. He has the justice of making us face the consequences of our own actions. You know, the New Testament, do unto others as you would have them do unto you, kind of part of the golden rule. Well, the word in Genesis when it says God dispersed Babel over the face of all the earth, is the same word that's used in Exodus 5 when Egypt spreads out the Israelites as slaves across the country to have them do their slave labor. God says, you want to keep others as slaves? You're going to be treated as slaves. Do unto others as you would have do unto you. We worship a God of justice who does not leave sin and brokenness unpunished or without justice applied. And we also see a God who says, I'm going to bring good even out of my judgments. Even out of the scattering of humanity, of the division and differences according to nation and tribe and people and language, I will bring good. See, God's treatment of them is ultimately a blessing because they were commanded to scatter, and He forces them back into obeying what He commanded in the first place. We believe as Christians that we have a God who knows everything and loves us deeply. And so following His commandments is actually the thing that's going to be the best for us in the long run. So even here in His judgment, God actually puts the rebels against His will back on a course that would be better for them in the long run. God gives us other promises throughout Scripture that one day the curse of Babel would be turned for good. So let's go there. Let's look at where does our hope for a redeemed and renewed politics come from. We're going to read Acts 2, verses 1 through 12. Brian texted me this week and said, I see you're being brave and ignoring the church calendar by skipping straight to Pentecost after Easter. Anyway, inside baseball, I just thought he was very funny. We're going to read Acts 2, starting in verse 1. When the day of Pentecost arrived, they were all together in one place. And suddenly there came from heaven a sound like a mighty rushing wind, and it filled the entire house where they were sitting. And divided tongues as of fire appeared to them and rested on each one of them. And they were all filled with the Holy Spirit and began to speak in other tongues as the Spirit gave them utterance. Now there were dwelling in Jerusalem Jews and devout men from every nation under heaven. And at this sound the multitude came together, and they were bewildered, because each one was hearing them speak in his own language. And they were amazed and astonished, saying, Are not all these who are speaking Galileans? And how is it that we hear each of us in his own native language? Giant list incoming. Here we go. Parthians and Medes and Elamites and residents of Mesopotamia, Judea and Cappadocia, Pontus and Asia, Phrygia and Pamphylia, Egypt and parts of Libya belonging to Cyrene, and visitors from Rome, both Jews and proselytes, Cretans and Arabians. We hear them telling in our own tongues the mighty works of God. And all were amazed and perplexed, saying to one another, What does this mean? And that's kind of our last question this morning. What does this mean? What do we see here in Pentecost? What is the promise for our human-to-human politics, our getting things done together relationships? I think we see the hope of a renewed unity, of connection and harmony that is of a divine character and nature. Now, we have to make a quick proviso here, a quick concerning note. We have to note that we are not told to anticipate the fulfillment of what we see happening here at Pentecost in the form of any earthly kingdom, country, power, or even something as small as a community. This is not something that we are looking to any secular governing body for. No group can experience this just out of togetherness of purpose or mission or values or cares or so on and so forth. This is something supernatural that we as the church are the hope for on earth. This is the church that we're seeing this fulfillment in. God's people gathered together globally and locally and brought into unity by the power of the Holy Spirit at work within us. And both here in Acts 2 and in the ultimate fulfillment of this passage that we read before the message in Revelation 7, we see that it is not in the elimination of who we are as people, our unique personhood, that we find this new supernatural unity, but that it is instead in God bringing a supernatural ability into our hearts for us to understand and appreciate each other in our uniqueness. Here in Acts, it doesn't say, and then God gave them all the secret hyper language that we will all speak in eternity so that they could understand each other. In Revelation 7, it doesn't say, "And I looked, and I saw a crowd of amorphous figures, no longer identifiable by any unique characteristics, but rather blended together into a mush of Jesus-iness." As we're not seeing like God just kind of washes everything off and we all look exactly the same and speak exactly the same. So God is bringing us together, and John says, I saw everybody. I saw every skin color and facial shape and eye color and age and gender and nationality and clothing style and haircut. I saw everything that would show the multitude of differences between us as a human being. Acts 2 spends a ridiculous amount of parchment listing all the different peoples who heard the gospel. It's like 4 verses just giving you the names of different nationalities and provinces and all these different people hearing it in their own way. God doesn't erase our unique personhood in our new unity. He supernaturally helps us to look at each other and find value in the ways that we are different instead of threats, to see beauty in each other's uniqueness rather than hostility. So we see here in Acts a promise that the church, the people of God, can be a place where politics, getting things done together, looks like how we were created to be. A common mission, a common goal, pulling in the same way, and excited about the ways that we're different from each other and the ways that that helps us to pursue the goal that God has given us. Even if that does mean it's going to take work and struggle to not slip back into the fallen politics of Babel, where other people are useful to me. We can do that work together. And our hope that we can do that work together isn't based on us being good enough for it, smart enough for it, moral enough for it, etc., etc. It's based on who God is and what He's done for us. The Apostle Paul said that in Christ there is no division amongst Christians because we all need God's grace equally. We are all sinners, as Romans says. We all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God, and we all need God's grace, the grace that we have been seeing ever since the garden, when God chose to redeem that which had rebelled, to save that which had sinned. We divide ourselves as human beings by ethnicity, language, geography, etc. You name it, we'll find a way to divide over it. But God says, I will bring them together. I will paint my mosaic of infinite beauty in all the hues of human flesh. I will draw my people together from every corner of the world. I will arrange a chorus of every language on earth, and in my infinite power, every voice will harmonize, every language will interweave, every note will be in key, not because they're the same, but because He has called every one of them His, and He has called every one of them good. You might be familiar with this picture of Jesse Owens, the man in the middle. Owens was being awarded the gold medal for the long jump at the Berlin Olympics in 1936 on the very brink of World War II. His victory stood as a testament against the poisonous rhetoric of racial superiority preached by Hitler that was at that very moment poisoning the minds and hearts of millions. You might be familiar with Owens, but you probably aren't familiar with the man doing the Hitler salute behind him. That man's name was Luz Long. In contradiction to the message of the picture, Luz enjoyed training with Owens in the weeks before the games and was the first person to congratulate him after his winning jump, shaking Owens' hand as Hitler looked on, and even staying in touch via mail before the war. Perhaps that's why Luz, despite the prestige that would have been afforded by his performance, was placed on the front lines in North Africa and later killed in Sicily. Miraculously preserved in the chaos of World War II was the last known letter that Luz sent to Owens that somehow made it there, secretly sent as the war had already started and he was stationed in North Africa. That letter said in part, I am here, Jesse, where it seems there is only the dry sand and the wet blood. I do not fear so much for myself, my friend Jesse. I fear for my wife who is home, and my young son Carl, who has never really known his father. My heart tells me, if I am being honest with you, that this is the last letter I shall ever write. If it is so, I ask you something. It is something so very important to me. It is that you go to Germany when this war is done. Someday find my Karl and tell him about his father. Tell him, Jesse, what times were like when we were not separated by war. I am saying, tell him how things can be between men on this earth. I love that line. That hour in Berlin when I first spoke to you, when you had your knee upon the ground, I knew that you were in prayer. Then I knew not how I knew that, but now I do. I know it is not by chance that we came together. And you, I believe, will read this letter while it should not be possible to reach you for a greater purpose than our friendship. I believe this shall come about because I think now that God will make it come about. This is what I have to tell you, Jesse. I think I now might believe in God, and I pray to Him that even while it should not be possible for this to reach you, that these words I write will still be read by you. Your brother, Luz. One of the infinite miraculous effects of the gospel is that the man in the back can write his last letter to the man in the middle and call him brother, to credit him for the start of his mental process toward believing in God, to believe in a better, more beautiful vision of how things can be, I love that line, how things can be between men on earth. Luz had that hope, Jesse had that hope because of who God is and the hope that is in Jesus. Hope that He can remake us in His image into doing politics, getting things done together the way He made for us for in the beginning. We get to be part of the start, the first fruits of God's resurrection as He begins to restore His world and our relationships with each other and with God.